So, do the Cleveland Browns have a problem at running back? Well, they didn't about 2 weeks ago. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here, then please do me a favour and hit that subscribe button. So kicking off our offensive position group previews, starting with what I thought was going to be the easiest position group to do on offense, and that is running back. But of course, due to a recent arrest, that's no longer the case. So I might as well start by addressing the elephant in the room, I suppose. Of course, Quinshon Judkins was arrested, was it last week now? Charged with domestic violence. He's had his initial court date. We'll obviously see. I'm not here to talk about that. I've done a video on that if you want to see that. But, we'll obviously see what comes from that. But one thing we do know is that he will get suspended regardless of what the outcome is. That's just the rules of the NFL player conduct policy. Just for being in this situation, that's going to be a 5 or 6 game suspension, in my opinion. Mike Hall last year, even though all the charges were dropped and the initial person's statements and all of that redacted, he was still suspended for 5 games. So Quinshon is going to get suspended. That's not really a debate. So, how long, we'll have to wait and see. But as I said, it's probably going to be 5-6 games. So, of course, that is not great. It's going to be the first 5 or 6 games. And as I've spoken on this channel before, probably the Browns' toughest stretch next year is those first 6 games. So, missing, obviously, who was going to be your lead back for that period, not great. It's going to be, it's going to have a negative effect on the run game over those first 6 games. So, obviously, there's a load of talk about what the Browns should do, regarding to should they add someone and all of that. We'll get into that. But, Quinshon aside, let's first talk about the guys that, are in the room and aren't going to be suspended. Starting with Jerome Ford, who, it's funny because I seem to be one of the only people that still has, some faith in Jerome Ford. And I say this as, I have to preference that when I say some faith, I'm not saying I expect Jerome Ford to come in this year and be a top 10 running back in the NFL and get over 1,000 yards. That's not what I'm saying. But in a role that he can be used in terms of as a third down back, I do think he can contribute to the team, and I do think he can be productive in that role. People will point to the last 2 seasons where, in my opinion, he's had to, he's not been able to play that role because of, injuries and stuff like that. He's had to take more on and play behind, 4th string tackles, all the injuries that we've had over this offensive line in the last few years. So, you're asking someone to run behind what is a pretty dreadful offensive line, and do so in a way that is not really suited to his skill set. So I do think that he does get a little bit of an unfair rap. I do think, all things equal, which, might not be with the Quinshon injury, of course, but, let's say Quinshon wasn't injured and just expecting this suspended, and expecting to see this running back room how it was supposed to be, then, that's why I had faith in Jerome Ford and was happy with him on the roster, because I do think and did think that he could be productive in that role. Of course, we're going to have to see what happens with an increased role. He might, is he going to have to be the number 1 back? We'll have to wait and see. But it's going to be 5 or 6 games once that suspension's over and Quinshon Judkins is back and this room looks how it's supposed to. I do think you will see good production from Jerome Ford in that role as a third down back and more of that kind of secondary, tertiary guy. As I said, everyone points to the last couple of years where everyone wants to make the jokes about him being tackled behind the line of scrimmage and having no vision and all of this stuff, but there was a stat that someone managed to find and work out the other day, and when he wasn't tackled behind the line of scrimmage or hit behind the line of scrimmage, shall I say, he averaged 7 yards a carry, which was second in the NFL out of any running back. And again, I'm not saying that as as evidence for why I think he's going to be a number one back. But I just, that's evidence for as I said, the unfair rap that he does get. I do think just playing behind such a bad offensive line in a role that's not suited to your skill set is the reason why, people kind of have this, when they think of Jerome Ford, they just think of him getting tackled in the backfield, because that happened a lot, but that happened a lot to any of the running backs on the Cleveland Browns roster over the last couple of years, just because of how bad the run game overall and the offensive line have been. So, of course, we'll have to see. I mean, I don't want him having 200-300 carries, as I said, but in a row with, last year, 100 carries, 500 yards, 5.4 yards per carry. And, as I said, that is impressive when you consider how bad this run game was last year. Yes, you can, of course, point to the 4 big plays that he had, that if you take those away, then yes, those averages look a lot different. But in the end of the day, you can do that with quite a lot of players. There's quite a lot of players in any given year where, take away their 5 biggest plays and their average is going to look nowhere near as good as it obviously does. So I do think that is quite an unfair thing to do for Jerome Ford. So, with Jerome Ford, as I said, he's a big play running back. He's a third down back. Get him the ball in the right spots and he can create big plays. He's shown that. Back-to-back seasons with 65 plus yards runs, 65 plus yard touchdowns. So, he can create those big plays. It's just about putting him in the right position and, that benefits his skill set. And as I said, we'll have to wait and see, of course, what that looks like over the first 5 or 6 games with the Judkins suspension. But I do think when this room looks as it's supposed to with all 3 of those guys in there, we will see production out of Jerome Ford in that role. Moving on to Dylan Sampson, who, similar to Jerome Ford, is more of that kind of third back, that more explosive kind of guy, not an every down back. But he did carry the ball over 250 times last year in college, 258 to be exact, 1,491 yards, 22 touchdowns. I mean, he was the SEC Player of the Year. Yes, you can point to, there was no amazing quarterback that came out of the SEC last year that put up in crazy stats that, allowed him to win that award, but he still won the award, 278 plays overall. So while this is someone that, as I said, when this room is going to look as it's supposed to, he's going to be the second back, and he's going to be more of that complementary guy to a Quinshon Judkins. In those first 5-6 games without him, I don't think there's a reason why, not to believe that he can manage a more increased role. As I said, over 250 carries last year in college. I can see him being able to handle a more increased role. Will it hurt his averages? Will it not look as good as maybe it would have looked with this room fully intact for the whole season? Maybe not. And of course, same applies to Jerome Ford as well. But we'll have to wait and see. But Dylan Sampson is someone that I am excited about. Someone that I had as one of the top 10 running backs in the draft this year. Wasn't someone that I expected them to target because I expected them to go running back early. And whilst I called for them to draft 2 running backs, I was not convinced that they would actually do it, and especially not within the first 4 rounds. So to get Dylan Sampson, that was a pick that I was happy with. Made that known, and someone that I am excited about to see for the Cleveland Browns. He's a fast back, he's an explosive back, someone that can, similar to Jerome Ford, create explosive plays. Looking forward to see what he can do. And as I said, if he does have to play that more increased role, maybe he's the number 1 back for the first 5 or 6 games ahead of Jerome Ford. Then I do think he can, manage and be more than serviceable in that role. But when the suspension's over and Judkins is back, and this, as I said, this room looks how it's supposed to look, he will be more of that secondary guy, that more third down back, similar to Jerome Ford, but someone that will be productive in that role. I am sure. And then obviously the third guy, Pierre Strong. Don't really expect much out of Pierre Strong. It's actually incredible how he keeps finding a way to get chances, because whether it's an injury or whatever. Now this year, of course, with the Judkins suspension, it's looking like Pierre Strong is going to start the year on this roster and be that third that third running back for the first 5 or 6 games. Unless they do bring someone else in. But with if the suspension didn't happen and all guys were going to make this were available, then there's an argument to be made that Pierre Strong maybe might not have made the roster. Yes, they usually carry 4 running backs, but with obviously a fullback currently on the 90-man roster as well. So there was no guarantee that Pierre Strong was going to make the roster, whereas now he's going to make the roster unless they bring someone else in, because as I said, obviously with the Judkins suspension. So somehow Pierre Strong keeps finding a way to get snaps and get on this roster. We'll see how it goes. We of course haven't really seen that much out of him in his time in Cleveland, but he's still, I was going to say young, but he's not really young for a running back now, really, is he? He's 26. So I don't expect much from Pierre Strong. Let's just hope that he can contribute in any role that he does get, especially in those 5 or 6 games where I expect he's probably going to have to be that third running back. And let's just touch wood that Dylan Sampson and Jerome Ford stay healthy over those first 5 or 6 games, because as I said, you don't want to be in a situation where Pierre Strong's starting at running back. But as I kind of mentioned, you would have expected the Browns to have carried 4 running backs. If this suspension didn't happen, all guys were available. But they could potentially carry 3 on the initial 53-man roster, with of course Judkins being suspended. So that could open the door for fullback Troy Hairston, as I mentioned, to maybe make the roster. With the Browns going back to Stefanski's bread and butter on offense, it wouldn't be shocking to see a fullback make the roster. The Browns had Andy Janovich for Stefanski's first 2 years here, so that certainly wouldn't be something that would be a shock. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, if Judkins wasn't suspended, maybe Hairston made the roster ahead of a Pierre Strong, but that's probably less likely now. But it does also increase his chance of making the roster, just because of course Judkins will be suspended. That is another roster spot that is available. Of course, as mentioned as well, this does open the question of whether they should bring in another running back. With Judkins going to be missing the first minimum, in my opinion, 5 or 6 games. You look at the guys that are out there. I'll be honest, it's not great. Jamal Williams, maybe. I'm not sure. The thing is, if you're bringing someone in, you would ideally be bringing someone in to take more of that load off that you're going to be missing with Quinshon Judkins. As I said, you don't want to see Jerome Ford in that primary role. He's better suited as a third down guy. So, someone like a Jamal Williams, is he going to be able to come in and play that amount of snaps or any kind of that role? I don't think so. Gus Edwards, kind of similar, just with the amount of injuries that he's had the last few years. Jeff Wilson, Naheem Hines, someone that of course was here and was injured. Chase Edmonds, Dearness Johnson is a name that I think if I was going to bring anyone in, that is the only person I would bring in. And maybe Dante Foreman, I suppose you could argue as well. But 2 guys that you could bring in very cheap on money that you have no problem cutting once Judkins is available, if it gets to that, and they don't show you anything in those first 5-6 games. But for me, if you do want to bring someone in, it would be Dearness Johnson or of course Dante Foreman, because as I said, you're bringing in someone just to fill that role for the first 5 or 6 games. So bringing in a guy that is familiar with the scheme, familiar with the coaches, familiar with the team, that makes a lot more sense. It won't take them really any time to adjust. And as I said, when you're just using them as a bandage, essentially, that's the kind of best option you can get for that. So personally, I probably wouldn't. I don't think they will. I think they will just roll with Jerome Ford, Dylan Sampson and Pierre Strong. But if they were to bring in another guy, for me, it would either be Dearness Johnson or Dante Foreman. I don't really see the point in bringing anyone else in. They're not going to trade for someone just to play for 5 or 6 games. So more than likely, it is going to be, as I said, Ford, Sampson and Pierre Strong, but we'll obviously wait and see what they do. But as with all rooms, what should we expect from this room this season? Of course, Judkins being suspended is going to slightly temper my expectations for this room, given that, he was going to be the lead back. It's annoying because, I was very excited for this room. This was one of the rooms I mentioned at the start. This was going to be a really easy preview because I was really excited, from what the potential of this room this year. And obviously now that's going to slightly, as I said, be tempered. But, I do still think we will see better production overall from this room than we've seen the last 2 years, even with Judkins being suspended the first 5 or 6 games. They have enough guys to get by for those games without Judkins. I know people might not agree with that, but, I think there's more than serviceable carries and snaps that you can get out of those 3 guys to keep you ticking, and especially with going back to what they do on offense and hopefully getting more improved offensive line play. And obviously when Judkins then does come back, which he will, this is the NFL. He won't get the guaranteed money that he wanted, but they will still sign him, and he will come straight back in and play as soon as the suspension is over. You might think that's gross. Nobody's going to argue with you about that. But as I said, that's just the NFL. I've said many times, you never look to the NFL for lessons on morality. So, that's just kind of how it is. And that's the other thing as well. I still expect Quinshon Judkins to be good, and he's probably going to have a good NFL career. So it's going to be hard for fans to get used to seeing him featured a lot early on. And, hopefully, regardless of what actually happened, he can come back in, rebuild his image and, put it behind him, shall we say, for his sake, and the fans, because as I said, I still expect him to be a good running back. I've talked a lot about how he was one of my top running back guys this year. So, I still expect that to be the case, even with this, of course, happening. So, as I said, that's going to just have to be something that we have to get used to. So I do still think, as I said, this running back room is going to be good going forward. Yes, it's going to take a slight step back those first 5-6 games, but overall, across the whole season, we are going to see, in my opinion, more production than we've seen the previous 2 years. That obviously coincides with the offensive line. They need to be healthy, need to get better performances out of them. As I said, hopefully going back to a more, wide zone scheme and getting guys like Wyatt and Joel moving around on the boundary, and that will bring out the strengths of this offensive line, which we saw, in those first few years under Kevin Stefanski, which will result in better performances from the run game, regardless of who's in there. That was kind of one of the strengths of this run game the first few years of Kevin Stefanski. Of course, we had Nick Chubb, and that having Nick Chubb makes any run game good. But when those games when Nick Chubb wasn't available on, we all remember the Dearness Johnson game, etc. And Kevin Stefanski was able to, similar with quarterbacks, to be honest, get guys in there and operate that system to a level that is serviceable to win games. Not saying it's blows you away or anything, but can win games with it. So, as I said, hopefully a combination of improved offensive line play and health, that will result in better performances from this running game and this running back room, regardless, even with Judkins missing the first 5 or 6 games. So, to summarise, yes, missing Judkins the first 5-6 games is not great, not ideal. That was your number one lead back. So, any team that is without their number one lead back for the first 5-6 games is going to see a drop off in the production that you would have seen. But overall, I do still think we will see more production, increased production from this running back room. We'll see, not just increased production in terms of the stats and stuff, but in terms of actually in the game and, scoring more touchdowns, keeping them in games more, and actually being able to use that run game as as something that is a positive and not a negative, in that offense like it has been the last 2 years. So I do think we will see increased production regardless. Jerome Ford, Dylan Sampson, Pierre Strong, I expect them to probably just roll through the first 5 or 6 games with those guys. And, you know, a lot of people might not like that, but, you know, look at the guys that are available. There's not really much guys out there. You're not going to trade for someone. You're not giving up assets for someone just for 5 or 6 games. So that's probably going to be the most likely outcome. It's those 3 guys for the first 5, 6 games. I'm okay with that, to be honest. If they were to bring anyone in, maybe a Dearness Johnson, maybe a Dante Foreman. But as I said, you know, Jerome Ford and Dylan Sampson are probably better than those 2 guys anyway. So it, you know, how much value you actually get in there. So I'm okay with rolling with those 3 guys. I'm sure, you know, as I said, with the hopefully increased offensive line play, better health out of that offensive line, better health out of this room overall, those 3 guys will be more serviceable and be able to kind of hold the fort for those first 5 or 6 games. And then when Judkins comes back, I expect him to be as good as I expected him to be before this happened. And this run game with him, Jerome Ford and Dylan Sampson to be productive and a lot more productive than we've seen the last 2 years. But that's the running game, running back room overall. Can't even. I'll end it there because I can't even put 5 words together apparently at this point now. So as I said, you know, this was meant to be the easiest one. This was meant to be the most excited room on the offense, to be honest. But it's taken a slight hit, but I still expect it to be more productive than what we've seen the last few years. But that will do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you do enjoy my content, then please drop this video a like, hit the subscribe button. It's free, but it really, really helps out my channel. You can also check the links in the description to see where you can follow and interact with me on social media. As I always say, I'm trying to build a community of Cleveland Browns fans, and even if that means I only get to talk to 1 fan a day, I'm happy because I'm talking Browns football with the best fan base in the world. Thanks again for watching, guys. Have an amazing week, but most importantly, go Browns.